il professore non ha bisogno di essere presentato, sapete che adesso insegna, quindi emerito, non emerito, yes? Emerito, però con flessibilità, diciamo, a Oxford, il suo ultimo quindi, luogo di insegnamento, e ha pubblicato un numero abbastanza importante di volumi sul problema sinottico, sul segreto messianico, eccetera. Quindi nel primo volume in 83, The Messianic Secret, Issues in Religion and Theology, e in lo stesso anno quindi un libro che ciascuno di noi ha letto, sull'ipotesi di Griesbach, quindi 83, e dopo quindi è stato curatore di molti volumi sul problema sinottico, su ciò che oggi studieremo, e in particolare un libro su Luke's Literary Achievement, uscito in 95. Ecco, dunque, e questi ultimi anni è andato verso i padri della Chiesa, perché ha pubblicato una monografia ben curata sulla seconda di Clemente, dunque Introduction, Text and Commentary. Quindi ci sarebbero molte cose. Quindi nel 96 ho notato Luke, New Testament Guides, pubblicato in Sheffield, quindi in 96, e altre cose sulla cristologia di Luca, eccetera. Quindi non è che non dobbiamo, non dobbiamo non ascoltare un specialista di Luca, e specialmente il problema sinottico. Quindi la ringrazio a nome vostro e lo ascoltiamo volentieri. Up to you, Christopher.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. One or two brief words of introduction. First, an apology. I'm afraid I speak no Italian at all, so everything has to be in English. I will try to speak slowly, but my apologies that I cannot speak your own native language. Thank you, first of all, very much indeed for the invitation to be here to speak to you this morning. It's my first visit to the Biblicum, and it's a very great honor for me to be here. So I'm very, very grateful for the invitation to be here. Thank you to you all individually for coming at 9 o'clock in the morning to hear something on the Synoptic Problem. I am fully aware that the Synoptic Problem is not the main focus of scholarly interest for quite a lot of people. So I'm very grateful to you for coming so early in the morning to this paper. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation for my paper. My apologies if it's not helpful. It's just putting out the main points of each of my points of my argument as I go through. They are all in English, I'm afraid. It's not in Italian, and I put some of the texts in English as well. If it's not helpful, then just please ignore it. So then, Luke and the Synoptic Problem. Study of the Synoptic Problem continues to attract a significant level of scholarly interest and debate, at least amongst some people. It's true that many assume that the Synoptic Problem has been fully solved in some form of the so-called two-document hypothesis, with the twin poles of the theory of Markan priority to explain the left-hand diagram on the picture here. Markan priority to explain agreements in the triple tradition, and the existence of some kind of Q source to explain the agreements between Matthew and Luke in the double tradition. However, both parts of the hypothesis have been questioned, especially in recent years. In the second half of the 20th century, the theory of Markan priority was radically questioned by advocates of the so-called Griesbach or two-gospel hypothesis. That's the middle diagram here, arguing that Mark was a secondary conflation of Matthew and Luke. And more recently, the existence of Q has been questioned by advocates of what's been called the Farah hypothesis, accepting the theory of Markan priority, but arguing that Q did not exist and that the Matthew-Luke agreements in the double tradition are due to Luke's knowledge and direct use of Matthew. These two alternatives to the two-document hypothesis are probably the most influential alternatives proposed in recent years. Other solutions have been proposed by individuals from time to time, many other solutions, but they have never gathered as much more general, widespread support from others, as the two gospel hypotheses and the Farah hypothesis have. At one level, the situation regarding the synoptic problem hasn't changed very much over the last 100 years or so. Nevertheless, the nature and the substance of some of the arguments that have been used and the degree of certainty which has been claimed for any proposed solution have been radically affected by more recent developments and debates in this area of gospel studies. For many in the late 19th and early 20th century, the synoptic problem was thought to have been finally, definitively solved with the two document hypothesis. The work of Holtzmann and Wernli in Germany was thought to have been decisive, and in England, the further work of Sanday, Streeter, and others was believed to have cemented the theory. This then led to claims which, from the perspective of the present day, are now widely regarded as far too optimistic. So Albert Schweitzer famously said at one point that the Markan hypothesis was no longer a mere hypothesis, but an assured fact. Willy Marxsen said that the two-source theory was no longer just a theory, but an assured finding. Today, such claims sound wildly overinflated. The resurgence of interest in the synoptic problem from the 1960s onwards owed much to the tireless enthusiasm of William Farmer, and although he may not have convinced many with his own particular source theory, the two gospel hypothesis, the debates which he engendered have left their mark on contemporary study of the synoptic problem in many ways, not least of which is the abandonment of any claims to certainty about any one particular solution to the synoptic problem. All our theories are hypotheses, and there is no certainty. It's now widely accepted that the synoptic problem will never be solved with mathematical certainty. All we can do is claim greater or lesser degrees of probability for any particular theory. Further, it's widely accepted by most, I think, that any solutions that we propose are probably at best simplifications of what was a far more complex situation in reality. For example, all the main solutions proposed today propose the use of one gospel by two other evangelists. For the two-document hypothesis, Mark was used by Matthew and Luke. For the purposes of discussion, it's almost always assumed that the earlier source is the same one, exactly, used by both later writers. Yet it's highly unlikely that the two later writers had access to the same manuscript of a common source. Almost certainly they will have used different manuscripts. And at a time when manuscripts were all copied by hand, it's inevitable that the text will have changed as it was copied, so that the precise wording of two manuscripts will never be identical. So a theory that Matthew and Luke used Mark, with a presumption usually unstated that it was exactly the same version of Mark used by both, is clearly a simplification of what was originally a more complex situation. Any hypothesis proposed then as a solution to the synoptic problem is almost certainly a simplification of the realities involved. As well as toning down unwarranted claims to certainty about solutions to the synoptic problem, more recent studies have focused to an increasing extent on the physical and social realities of the production of written texts in the first century, as perhaps throwing light on the theories of synoptic origins. So in the last 20 years or so have seen an ever-increasing focus on the physical realities of reading and writing. How did people actually read? How did people actually write? And the activity of authors and scribes in using sources, with also a greater awareness of the way in which other Greco-Roman writers at the time used sources in writing their works. Our evangelists were not just writing in a vacuum, they were writing in a social context in which other authors were doing the same. As well as taking more note of the importance of memory in the writing process. And such considerations have led to a realization that none of the various source theories on offer is immune from difficulties and potential anomalies. In many recent discussions of the synoptic problem, the Gospel of Luke has become one of the main foci of attention. As I mentioned earlier, the modern debate about the synoptic problem owed much to the work of Bill Farmer, advocating the Griesbach hypothesis as the main alternative to the two-document hypothesis. In the earlier stages of the revival of this Griesbach hypothesis, much attention was focused on Mark, trying to show that Mark perhaps was last, not first, of the three synoptic gospels to be written. However, a key plank in the argument as developed by Farmer was that solutions to the synoptic problem which did not postulate the existence of other hypothetical sources were to be preferred to those which do. Hence, in order to explain the Matthew-Luke agreements, advocates of the Griesbach hypothesis argued that Luke was directly dependent on Matthew, with no Q source postulated. So a significant part of later studies by advocates of the Griesbach hypothesis tried to show that Luke's agreements with Matthew throughout the whole of the tradition could be explained by Luke's dependence on Matthew alone. Today, the Griesbach hypothesis has probably become a feature of the past. The most strenuous defenders of the hypothesis, Farmer, David Dungan, David Peabody, have all died, and no one obvious has taken their place to defend the theory. The role of the most popular alternative to the two-document hypothesis has now been taken by the Farrer hypothesis, so-called, originally proposed in a very seminal essay in 1955 by Austin Farrer. The theory was developed massively in the work of Michael Goulder, though for many years he was a lone voice. But more recently, the theory has been energetically proposed by a number of scholars, Goodacre, Poirier, Watson, and is clearly garnering some significant support. It accepts the theory of Markan priority, so discussion of Mark is not really an issue. The significant difference comes in the proposed explanations of the Matthew-Luke agreements in the double tradition. For the two-document hypothesis, these are to be explained by common dependence on a Q source. For the Farrer hypothesis, they're due to Luke's direct dependence or direct knowledge and use of Matthew. So, in debates between advocates of the two-document theory and the Farrer hypothesis, the Gospel of Luke has very much been the prime focus of attention. Well, what have been then the main points of issue in the discussion? First, what has been famously called by B.H. Streeter the order of a crank. I do apologize for this. This is Streeter's terminology. I have not the faintest idea how that translates into Italian. And as I was thinking about it, I'm not quite sure what a crank precisely is in English. It's not quite an idiot. It's not quite a fool. It's somebody who certainly has a brain, but has a theory that is a rather, everybody else thinks is a rather crazy theory. So anyway, that is Streeter's so-called order of a crank.
Take your time, do not worry about it.
All right.
Take your time.
One of the issues has focused on the theory made some years ago by Streeter, who argued that it was, for him anyway, inexplicable, if Luke used Matthew, for Luke to have broken up Matthew's clear, well-structured composition, especially with the neatly constructed 5 teaching discourses, and then to have distributed this mostly non-Markan material in such an apparently haphazard way throughout his gospel. It seems to Streeter to make no sense for Luke to have reordered this Matthean material in the way that such a hypothesis presupposed. And as I say, in this famous or infamous phrase, Streeter claimed that the new Lucan order of the material was the order of a crank. Streeter's language was probably too extreme in English, anyway. And any argument claiming that a proposed procedure makes no sense is in danger of overstating the evidence. All one can say is that one cannot make sense of it at present, or I can make no sense of it now, or that nobody has yet made sense of it so far, but somebody perhaps at some stage will see the pattern and see the sense of it later. But certainly many advocates of the Farrer hypothesis have taken up Streeter's challenge and tried to claim that the order of a crank in Luke's gospel can actually make good sense. One famous attempt was that of Michael Goulder, though he failed to convince many people, even his own supporters of the Farrer hypothesis. Goulder claimed that Luke went through the text of Matthew, picking up and using various elements which he wanted and needed for his gospel. Then, having got to the end of Matthew, he proceeded to trawl backwards through the scroll of Matthew, taking up in reverse order the bits that he had not yet used. Such a procedure has, however, convinced very few people, if only because of the enormous logistical problems envisaged in reading a scroll backwards. With a scroll in continuous text, no spaces at all between words and paragraphs, no markers in the text, it would be extremely difficult to go backwards through a scroll, taking up one story, presumably reading forwards, and then jumping back to the start of the story to try and find the beginning of the story, to look at the end of the previous pericope, and somehow finding where the story started. It's perhaps easy enough for you, or relatively easy with my text here separated into paragraphs, and you can go to the start of the first paragraph. But if you hadn't got paragraphs, it would be extremely difficult to know where in just a mass of continuous text you were meant to go. Others have adopted a more general approach, basically showing that Luke's new order of the material makes very good Lucan sense. Goodacre and Watson, for example. Luke is not Matthew, so his ordering is not Matthew's ordering. Luke has his own agenda and his own way of ordering. His own order makes excellent Lucan sense. So, for example, in the section in Luke 11, verses 2 to 13, Luke uses some bits from Matthew. He uses the Lord's Prayer, the section on ask and you will receive, and he has his special L material, the parable of the friend at midnight, to create a compact little new Lucan unit on prayer. This is not Matthew's arrangement, but then Luke is not a scribe copying Matthew's text as closely as he can. He is an evangelist with his own ideas and writing a new text using materials from Matthew to reflect his own interests and concerns. I'm not sure that this kind of argument quite meets Streeter's point. I think there's no doubt at all that Luke's order of material makes good Lucan sense. In one way, that's just a tautology to say that Luke's order is Lucan. The order in Luke's gospel is manifestly Lucan because it's in Luke's gospel. But Streeter's point was, I think, not so much that the new Lucan order made sense in its own right, but that rather the process... Oh, I'm sorry, I've missed out my bullet points. The process of breaking up the Matthean order to produce such a wildly new, different order seemed to make no apparent sense. The reverse change seemed much easier to envisage as having happened. On the two-source theory, Luke is widely held to have preserved the original order of the double tradition material, Q, relatively unchanged. Matthew must have reordered this in significant measure to produce his 5 main teaching discourses, all of which are very clearly focused on broad themes with their own focus of attention, the Sermon on the Mount on ethics, the mission charge, and so on. So it's not so much the new Lucan order in and of itself that is thought to create problems for any theory that Luke knew Matthew. It's rather trying to determine why Luke broke up the clear structure of Matthew's material and then reordered things. And simply showing that Luke's present order makes some kind of sense does not, I think, really meet this point fully. As we'll see later, it also presupposes a procedure on Luke's part that is very unusual in the ancient world in relation to other writers who used sources to create their own new work. Secondly, the issue of what's called simplicity sometimes, or Occam's razor. A second major plank in the argument for the Farrer hypothesis has been an appeal, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit, to simplicity and/or to the principle of Occam's razor. It's often argued that the Farrer hypothesis, by not appealing to a lost hypothetical source Q, involves a much simpler hypothesis to explain synoptic agreements in disagreements. In the work of Farmer, and advocating the Griesbach hypothesis rather than the Farrer hypothesis, it was a fundamental principle that one should try to explain the data without appealing to hypothetical lost sources, if at all possible. Hypothetical is a very dirty word for some. Solutions to the synoptic problem which do not posit the existence of hypothetical sources were to be given priority over ones which do. And many modern advocates of the Farrer hypothesis have implicitly taken up this assumption. So, and similarly, many have appealed to the principle of Occam's razor, entiar non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatem. I won't presume to translate that for you. I'm sure you all can translate it. In this context, this is taken as implying that one should not postulate the existence of extra sources, entiar, unnecessarily. Since then, it's argued that Matthew-Luke's agreements can be explained without postulating another source Q. This theory should be preferred, unless it is absolutely necessary. The argument has a certain appeal for many, but I suspect is somewhat weak when examined critically. I suspect, too, it relies on a slightly skewed notion of what exactly the hypothesis in question is. It's perhaps all too easy to pose the question about the synoptic problem and the debate between the two document hypothesis and the Farrer hypothesis in the form, did Q exist? There is then an implied presumption that it is simpler to posit a situation where a hypothetical Q did not exist than a situation where a hypothetical source did exist. However, I think the fundamental question is not so much did Q exist, but rather did Luke know and use Matthew? Q only comes onto the horizon if one argues that Luke did not know Matthew, since then one has to explain the extensive double tradition agreements between Matthew and Luke on the basis of their mutual independence. If then one poses the basic question as, did Luke know Matthew, and takes the main hypothesis which one is testing as Luke did know Matthew or Luke did not know Matthew, then the parameters of the debate become rather different. Such a claim itself is, of course, a hypothesis, just as positing the existence of Q is a hypothesis. And also the theory that Luke used Matthew is no less and no more hypothetical than the existence of a Q source. Hence, the arguments that Q is a hypothetical source and hence of dubious value, I think, are beside the point. All our theories about synoptic origins are hypothetical in that they are hypotheses. They are theories which are trying to make sense of the data that we have, namely the pattern of agreements and disagreements between the Gospels. Further, I suspect that any appeal to Occam's razor may be something of a double-edged sword in this context. I fear I know absolutely nothing about medieval philosophy, and hence I am completely ignorant of the work of William of Ockham himself. But in this context, I think it's probably misguided to restrict the entiar involved to just the sources being postulated in a hypothesis trying to explain the synoptic problem, and then to count them, as if the entiar are just simply the number of sources, and if your number is low, you're being less hypothetical than if the number is a bit higher. Because a solution to the synoptic problem not only seeks to describe what happened, A used B as a source, but also to argue that the suggested scheme of one evangelist using the work of another is reasonable and makes good sense of the data. If one suggests that A used B, then one needs to show that this produces a reasonably sensible and coherent pattern of usage. We need to explain how A used B. We need then to show that the redactional activity of A in using B makes reasonable sense. And with this in mind, the issue for the Farrer hypothesis is not just to produce a scheme whereby you get a minimum number of sources in the diagram of relationships, but also to explain Luke's and others' redactional procedure on the basis of the hypothesis. And in this, arguably, I will suggest, Luke's procedure appears to be anything but simple. Further, the entiar involved, which include not only the number of sources postulated, but also the redactional aims of Luke as an evangelist, actually have to be multiplied very, very considerably. And we'll see this in relation to a number of different issues in what follows. Thirdly, looking at other Greco-Roman authors, quite a lot of recent work has been undertaken in recent years to see how other Greco-Roman authors from about the time the Gospels were written used sources in their work and used sources in their own compositions. Nearly always, it seems, authors at the times used their sources in a relatively simple way. Basically, they did not use more than one source simultaneously. In any case, such a procedure would have been extremely difficult in terms of the logistics of handling scrolls and reading them. Scribes and authors did not have the luxury of what we have here today, very large flat tables on which they can spread out all their notes and have sight of them. I was told I mustn't move around too much, but they could see more than one thing simultaneously. It would have been all but impossible to write a text oneself and actually see more than one other scroll at the same time. All this seems to be confirmed by looking at the way in which authors did actually make use of sources. As far as we can tell, most authors used one source at a time. They did not undertake generally a detailed conflation of different sources in any one passage. And generally, too, they followed the order of the one source they were using at any one time. With this in mind, how does Luke's procedure then seem on the different hypotheses generally proposed? On the two-document hypothesis, Luke seems very reasonable and thoroughly in line with what other writers of the time did. If he used Mark and Q, he must have used them in fairly large blocks, following Mark for a time, and then Q, supplementing it with his other special material, and generally following the order of Mark and the order of Q fairly conservatively. On the thorough hypothesis, Luke's procedure looks very strange. He followed Mark in large blocks and generally followed Mark's order, with one or two exceptions. And indeed, he seems to have generally preferred Mark for most of the triple tradition. So generally, he seems to have followed Mark and Mark alone for this section of the material. But with Matthew, in accessing what we call the double tradition material, he must have followed a very different procedure. He must have extracted from Matthew all the non-Markan pieces, and he must have put them into his gospel in a totally different order. So why then did Luke use his two sources in radically different ways? Clearly, he must have made substantial use of Matthew, using a great deal, though by no means all, of Matthew's material. So one has to postulate a radically different attitude to his two postulated sources. The hypothesis then demands at least two very different attitudes to and use of his sources on the part of Luke, one of which is very unlike what other writers of the time seems to have done. Next major section on what have been very called traditionally Mark-Q overlaps. A special problem, I think, arises in the case of these so-called Mark-Q overlaps. It's accepted by all advocates of the two-document hypothesis that the two major synoptic sources, Mark and Q, were mostly separate, but just occasionally overlapped. So in the case of the parable of the mustard seed, the Beelzebul controversy, the preaching of John the Baptist, the temptation narrative, the mission charge, and perhaps one or two other cases, both Mark and Q contained a version of the same underlying tradition. I think the existence of such a phenomenon of overlapping sources is hardly surprising. If you have two sources, both containing Jesus' traditions, which never overlapped, it would seem far less likely. The label Mark-Q overlap might be thought to beg many questions, as it assumes the two-document hypothesis as a given, but whatever we label them, these pericopes are part of the tradition and require explanation on any source hypothesis that's trying to provide an overall solution to the synoptic problem. I think on the two-document hypothesis, these texts are reasonably easy, at least at one level, to explain. In general terms, for many of these texts, Luke appears to have preferred the Q version. His version often has nothing in common with Mark's beyond what is necessary to tell the underlying story. if you're going to tell the parable of the mustard seed, you've got to use the words mustard and you've got to use the word seed, but Luke and Mark don't agree in much else in their telling of that parable. Matthew seems to try to run the two versions together. I'll skip a little bit here if you're following the Italian version, the little bit in brackets. So in general terms, one could say, my bullet point here, Mark has X, Luke has Y, and Matthew has X and Y. And the two-document hypothesis, it seems to me, can provide a relatively satisfactory explanation of the texts, certainly for Luke. For the Farah hypothesis, however, I think there are quite serious problems. According to this hypothesis, Luke is using just Mark and Matthew. So he must have decided not to use all the Markan bits, what I've called X. He must then have used Matthew alone, but decided that he would only use the bits of Matthew which are not in Mark, the Y bits of Matthew. Such a process of unpicking or extracting all the non-Markan bits from Matthew, picking out the Y bits from Matthew, would have been quite a difficult process. Moreover, it seems quite unlike what any other author from antiquity did with sources. And in addition, it's quite unlike what Luke does elsewhere in the triple tradition, because elsewhere in the triple tradition, Luke decides to follow Mark resolutely and ignore Matthew. So Luke, in these, what we call overlap passages, is not only unlike any other ancient writer using sources, he's adopting a redactional procedure which is totally different from his procedure elsewhere in the triple tradition. So, sorry, I'm getting behind myself with these things. Luke's redactional procedure then, according to the Farah hypothesis, shows huge variation, and one could call it in English a rich variety if one's being kind. One could call it a completely self-contradictory mess if one is being unkind, depending on one's point of view. In relation to Mark, he generally sticks close to Mark and Mark's order, but in relation to Matthew, he changes the order massively at almost every point, though still retaining the substance of the material. It's not then as though he objected to the material of significant parts of Matthew. The first is thoroughly in line with what other ancient writers of the time do. The second is not. But then in the overlap passages, Luke adopts a totally different strategy. He now shuns Mark completely and somehow extracts just the non-Markan elements from Matthew. So going back to what I said earlier on simplicity and focusing not just on the numerical number of sources, but on the redactional procedure involved, looking at the question of how Luke used his sources, it seems that Luke's procedure is anything other than simple. On the Farah hypothesis, he seems to have adopted a range of different policies in relation to different parts of the tradition. Some people can and do argue that Luke's different policies in relation to his different sources, Mark and Matthew, simply means that he treated his different sources differently. I was once in a debate with Francis Watson, and he looked at me pityingly, and he said, well, Luke's using Mark and Matthew are different sources, and he uses different sources in a different way. What's wrong with that? But treating sources in a way that is quite anomalous for ancient writers generally, and treating the same sources in radically different ways in different parts of the tradition, for me raises large question marks against the hypothesis of the whole. Entiar non sunt multiplicanda praeta necessitatem. If the entiar are Luke's different redactional procedures in different parts of the tradition, then it would seem that for the Farah hypothesis they have to be multiplied very considerably. The redactional procedure by Luke here is certainly not simple. Then if simplicity is to be a touchstone for assessing a hypothesis' worth, then the Farah hypothesis, I think, scores rather low, and certainly lower than the two-document hypothesis. Finally, then, what has been called in English, and I apologize for the English again, alternating primitivity. And that's not a very easy English phrase, so I dread to think what it becomes in Italian. But a final factor to be considered here goes under this phrase, which is the argument, which is for me quite powerful, in favor of the two-document hypothesis, and where the Farrer hypothesis has to face considerable difficulties. And this refers to the phenomenon where, according to many, neither Matthew nor Luke has a monopoly of having a more primitive version of the tradition. Sometimes Matthew seems to be more original, sometimes Luke does. On the two-document hypothesis, this is fairly easily explained. Both evangelists have reworked the individual traditions from Q to reflect their own interests, their vocabulary, their situations, and so on. But they've done so independently, so that where one evangelist has changed Q, the chances are the other evangelist would have left the tradition unchanged. So this pattern of two evangelists giving the more primitive version alternately is not at all unexpected. So I give just a few examples to illustrate the point. There are certainly some cases where Luke's version does not seem to be original and Matthew's does. In one of the woes against the scribes and Pharisees that I've given here, in Matthew 23 and Luke 11, Jesus uses the analogy of cleansing the outside and the inside of cups, and then applies the picture to human beings. In Matthew, the wording and the image is relatively straightforward and easy to understand. There's a contrast between cleansing the outside and the inside of a cup, applied implicitly in Matthew to the outside and the inside of human beings. But in Luke, there is a somewhat jarring reference in the application to give for alms things that are within, that I've highlighted in red on this overhead here. The language bears little or no resemblance to the imagery used elsewhere in the saying. On the other hand, the exhortation to give alms is thoroughly Lucan. Luke clearly regards it as extremely important that people should give generously to those in need. It seems very likely then that Luke has modified the Q tradition as preserved in Matthew, working in a reference to his favorite topic of almsgiving and its crucial importance. So here Luke is secondary and Matthew is more original. However, at other points in the tradition, Luke seems to give a more original form of the tradition, and it's Matthew who's changed things. The two versions of the well-known Lord's Prayer, I think, provide a good example. I don't want to go into any of the tiny details of wording, but refer simply to the well-known differences in the length of the prayer in the two versions. Matthew's is, as is well known, consistently longer. The tendency of prayers is to grow in length over the course of time, and it's widely accepted that Luke's version here is more original in its scope. The extra phrases in Matthew's version represent secondary accretions, and again, as is well known, the prayer attracted yet more accretions with the added doxology in the version in the Didache. Specifically in relation to one detail of the wording, Luke's bold opening address, Father, seems to reflect an Aramaic Abba address, widely thought to be characteristic of Jesus' own address to God and passed on in Christian communities as distinctively Christian, as can be seen in Romans 8 and Galatians 4. So here, Matthew is secondary, Luke is more primitive. Another example, and I'll come back to this in my second lecture, in the final woe against the scribes and Pharisees, Jesus predicts that his followers and others will experience persecution, but the prediction of the form of the prediction varies. Here I just want to refer to the introduction to the prediction and who is the speaker. In Matthew, the oracle is placed directly on the lips of Jesus as the speaker. He looks forward to a time in the future when his followers, whom he is sending now, I am sending in the present, will suffer persecution. In Luke, the saying is attributed to the figure of the wisdom of God and seems to be set in the past, so the figures sent out by wisdom could be pre-Christian prophets. And indeed, Jesus himself could be one of these envoys of wisdom. Again, I'm not going to go into the details, but this major difference between Matthew and Luke is striking. In the present context, what is significant at these points where Luke differs from Matthew, Luke does not appear to be particularly Lucan. It does, though, tie up with another double tradition passage, namely Matthew 11:19, Luke 7:35, which is the end of the pericope about Jesus, comparing Jesus and John the Baptist, where it says at the end, wisdom is justified by her works in Matthew, children in Luke. In Matthew, the works of wisdom probably deliberately echoes the reference at the start of the long pericope in Matthew 11:2, which refer to the works of the Christ, the Messiah, so that Jesus is implicitly being equated with the person of wisdom here, a feature which can be found elsewhere in Matthew, notably, say, Matthew 11:28-30, come unto me all that travail and are heavy laden, which has many echoes of the sayings of wisdom in Sirach 51, here claimed by Matthew's Jesus for himself. So a tendency to equate Jesus with wisdom is fully in line with Matthew's own interests and concerns. Luke, though, generally knows nothing of this, nor does he show any redactional or editorial interest in the figure of wisdom as a personified being. Nowhere in Acts, nowhere in the speeches of Acts, where Luke's hand is most likely to be seen, can any such interests be seen. Given all this, it becomes very hard to see how or why Luke would have changed the version as he had found it in Matthew. He would have no qualms about the idea of prophets appearing in the Christian church. There are prophets in some of the churches in Acts, and Jesus sending out prophets and apostles, as in Matthew, would have been very congenial to him. So it's extremely difficult to see why Luke would have objected to the Matthean version, and if he did, why he changed it to the present version about a wisdom saying, I will send prophets and so on, where the end result doesn't look very Lucan at all. On the other hand, a reverse change is very easy to envisage. Matthew saw the reference to wisdom, changed the tradition in accordance with his known preference for identifying Jesus himself with the figure of wisdom. So in terms of the main hypotheses to the synoptic problem, the two-document hypothesis explain things well. Luke preserves the Q tradition more faithfully. The Lukean version is Q. Matthew changes it in line with his own known tendencies. I think the Farah hypothesis fares less well. Luke must have changed the Matthean order in a way that bears no relation to other Lucan interests or concerns at all. The general approach of the Farah hypothesis in relation to this general phenomenon has varied. Golder tried to argue that indeed at every point Luke was secondary. Others have claimed that perhaps at some points Luke had access to independent versions of the same tradition as Matthew and used that instead of Matthew. So, for example, Goodacre on the Lord's Prayer. Others have refused to engage in the debate at all. So Watson arguing that arguments about the detailed wording of individual sayings are completely inconclusive. But I think an appeal to independent traditions is very like a version of a Q slipping into the room quietly, and a refusal to engage with the issues at all, I think, risks leaving a large part of the relevant data out of consideration. Finally, then, a small note on minor agreements. No discussion of the synoptic problem would be complete without at least a mention of the famous or infamous minor agreements. These are texts in the triple tradition where Matthew agrees with Luke against Mark. And as is well known, many of them are extremely minor, involving a de instead of a kai, or using the aorist tense apen instead of the historic present lege. The number of substantive minor agreements is relatively small. The most famous is probably that of the three gospel accounts of the mockery of Jesus at the Sanhedrin trial that I put up here, where Matthew and Luke have the extra question, who is it who struck you? Tis estin ho paisas se. I'm sorry, my Greek is wrong. It should be an aorist participle paisas se. I'm sure experts among you spotted that instantly. Clearly, these agreements present a difficulty for the two-document hypothesis on the assumption that Matthew and Luke are independent and their agreements are explained by postulating a Q source. There should be no such agreements in the triple tradition. My next paragraph. But does the Farah hypothesis fare any better? Arguably not. As already stated, the minor agreements are very minor. They involve just tiny details of vocabulary. If, as the advocates of the Farah hypothesis argue, they show Luke's knowledge of and influence by Matthew, then it's somewhat surprising that Luke is influenced by Matthew to such a small extent, changing a chi to a de. If Luke were really influenced by Matthew, one might surely expect something rather more substantial from Matthew to show up in Luke, especially things that one would think were highly congenial to Luke. So, for example, it's rather surprising to me anyway that Luke does not include the famous blessing of Peter in Matthew 16. Luke clearly thinks very highly of Peter. He has his own account of Peter's individual call by Jesus in Luke 5. Peter is the leading figure in the early Jerusalem church in Acts. He makes two vitally important speeches in Acts 2 and Acts 3. Why then does Luke omit this highly charged and highly positive and substantial tradition from Matthew 16? Why does Luke omit the extra Beatitudes of Matthew 5? Matthew has 5 extra Beatitudes into the 4 that are in Luke. Further, some of them would have been highly congenial to Luke. For example, the blessing on the merciful, where it is precisely the mercy shown by the Good Samaritan that Luke makes central in his account of the parable. The ending in Luke 10:37 highlights the mercy which the Good Samaritan has shown to the man who is in need. So again, why does Luke avoid this beatitude? Luke's indebtedness to Matthew on the Farah hypothesis thus seems surprisingly varied and very hard to explain. Tiny details, then, of Matthew's account seem to creep in for the most part, but then again, in the overlap passages, Luke deserts Matthew and draws solely on deserts Mark, and draws solely on Matthew. I find it very hard to make sense, then, of this redactional procedure. No one can pretend that the minor agreements are easy to explain on the two-document hypothesis. Quite a few can plausibly be seen, I think, as the two independent writers changing Mark's somewhat awkward Greek, for example, in changing kai as a connecting participle to a more idiomatic de. Just very briefly, we have to bear in mind, too, that the original manuscript of any of our Gospels is quite some time after the writing of the Gospels themselves. Our earliest manuscript for some parts of the Gospels comes from some 150 to 200 years after their writing, and that's P45. And for some parts of the text, the earliest witness is 300 years later. And so, for example, in the case of that minor agreement, I think the text of Matthew 26 at that point is attested at the earliest point in our manuscript tradition in Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Vaticanus here in this city. So that's dated about 300 years after the time of the writing of the Gospel. Plenty of time for some changes in the Gospel, small changes to have worked their way into the tradition. And it may be that one or two of the minor agreements, as they appear now in our critical editions, may have arisen in this way, and that is one possible explanation of the minor agreement in Mark 14:65, but I won't bore you with all the details now. So finally, by way of conclusion, the synoptic problem will probably be never finally definitively solved in a way that satisfies everyone and commands universal consent. The nature of the evidence is such that this is simply not possible. Nevertheless, I would suggest that a consideration especially of Luke's gospel text, coupled with the evidence of Acts, suggests that some theory requiring a lost source or source materials, usually labeled Q, is the most satisfactory theory to explain the pattern of agreements and disagreements between the Gospels. The theory of Markan priority is widely held, all but universally today. The other plank of the two-document hypothesis, the existence of Q, does, I believe, make for the most satisfactory hypothesis to explain the evidence. Q is hypothetical in the sense that it is part of a hypothesis, the hypothesis that Luke did not know Matthew. The alternative hypothesis, which is just as much as a hypothesis that Luke did know Matthew and used his gospel as a main source, is, I believe, far less simple in the long run and involves a whole series about Luke's redactional procedure, which, taken as a whole, make, I believe, the overall hypothesis unpersuasive. But thank you very much for your patience.